Hi everybody. For the first part of the pre-work assignment for Chapter 5, I want to get you comfortable with the contribution format income statement. And take a look. It's very straightforward. You have your total sales minus your variable expenses, and what's left over is the contribution margin. And then you subtract out your fixed expenses to get the net operating income. And I think an example here, this first example is very simple. This is the first question of Question 1. It's the first requirement of Question 1. That we'll walk through together, but it's a very simple income statement, and I'll show you how this works. Now, one thing to keep in mind is we're always working with one product only. One product only. So when you're looking at these unit prices, that's the price for one product. So think like one t-shirt that sells for $10 each, and each shirt costs me $6 each to make. So let's pull this all together. If each product sells for $10 and I sell 100 shirts. If I sell 100 shirts at $10 per shirt, all I do is multiply that together to get my total sales of $1,000. Right? So you got units sold times your per unit equals units sold times per unit equals your total sales. Hopefully that's pretty straightforward. And in the same manner, my units sold times my variable cost per unit, units sold times variable cost per unit, variable expense per unit, or variable cost. In an income statement, you can call variable cost an expense. So variable expense per unit times units sold is going to give you your total variable expenses, which would be $600. So if I sell 100 shirts for $10 and each one cost me $6 each, that means I just made $400 in margin on those shirts. Okay, and that margin is going to be used to cover any of my fixed expenses. So think fixed expenses like I need to buy a tent or I need to rent a store to sell these shirts. But think the $6 is, what are the materials, direct materials, some labor, to actually make the shirt itself. So here we go. We have $1,000 in sales minus $600 in variable expenses equals $400 in contribution margin. But what about on a per unit basis? How much contribution margin do I make per shirt if I sell it for $10 and each shirt costs me $6? So my contribution margin per shirt, this right here is called a unit CM, or contribution margin per unit, is $4. So how did I get the $4? That is my selling price. Selling price minus my variable expense per unit is going to equal that unit CM. So we had $10 selling price minus $6 variable cost per unit equals the unit CM of $4. And basically what it means is every unit of product that I sell contributes $4 towards my bottom line. So it adds $4 to my bottom line. So if you look at this example, I sold 100 shirts times $4. I made $400 selling those 100 shirts in margin. That's everything except for my fixed expenses when you're talking about your margins. So I made $400 in margin, I covered $300 in fixed expenses, so I arrive at a net operating income of $100. So just keep that in mind how this flows. One other piece that I want you to look at is the percentage column. I always want you to be able to think percentages. Whenever you build these statements, I want you to do the three columns: total, per unit, and percentage. Sales will always be 100%. Always. And then variable expenses, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my variable expense per unit divided by my selling price per unit. I'm going to arrive at 60%. So it's 6 divided by 10. Or you can do 600 divided by 1,000 and you will always get the same answer. So either variable expenses in total divided by total sales, or variable expense per unit divided by selling price per unit. And then let's look at this one here. The CM percentage is 40%. That is your contribution margin per unit, my unit CM, divided by my selling price, or total contribution margin divided by total sales. So this is called CM ratio. The contribution margin percentage is also called CM ratio. And then this thing right here is called variable expense ratio, which is my variable expenses divided by my sales, or variable expense per unit divided by selling price per unit. So start to get comfortable with those terms, but look how they're all embedded in this one similar statement. And a lot of the problems we're going to do in this chapter are all going to revolve around this income statement. So let's do a little more practice on some of the next statements. So look at question 2 here. It's showing information differently. If you remember from question 1, we were given per unit selling price and variable expense data, and we were given number of units sold, and we were given our fixed expenses. So now in situation 2, we're given fixed expenses, but we're given total sales, total variable expenses, and units sold. Well, look at your original statement first. If I had $1,000 in sales and each one was sold for $10, how many must I have sold? Remember, it's one product only that we're selling. So if I take my $1,000 divided by 10, I can get 2 units sold. So just kind of keep this flow in mind. Total divided by per unit equals number of units. And then in reverse, units times per unit equals total. So if I'm given totals and I'm given my number of units, I should be able to figure out my per unit price. So likewise, if I take my sales, $5,000 in sales, and I sold 250, take your 5,000, divide it by your 250, and that's going to give you your per unit amount. So in our case, the per unit here would be $20, $5,000 divided by 250 units. So now we can do the same thing for variable expenses. Total divided by units equals per unit. See how this all works in one big loop? Total divided by per unit equals units. Total divided by units equals per unit. 3,000 divided by number of units is going to give me my variable expense per unit. So 3,000 divided by 250 gives you $12 per unit. See how we can keep filling out this income statement. I know sales minus variable expenses equals contribution margin. So if I sell 250 of these at 20 bucks each one costs me $12. So sell 250 at 20 bucks each one costs me $12. I'm going to make $2,000 in margin that can be used to cover my given $750 in fixed expenses. And we can figure out that our net operating income then must be $1,250. So what is my contribution margin per unit? That is my selling price minus my variable expense per unit. So that's $8 per unit. And what are these in percentages? Always, sales is 100%. My variable expense ratio is going to be 12 divided by 20. So my variable expense ratio will be 60%. You need to know that term, variable expense ratio. And my CM ratio, my contribution margin ratio, is going to be 8 divided by 20, which would be 40%. See a pattern here? Notice how 100% minus your variable expense ratio equals your CM ratio. Or 100% minus your CM ratio equals your variable expense ratio. So keep those facts in mind as you work through these problems all throughout the chapter. So let's look at the next scenario. Here we are given total sales and I'm giving my selling price per unit. In the last situation we were given total sales and number of units, so I was able to take my total sales divided by units to get my dollar value per unit selling price. Well, here I'm given total dollar value of sales and I'm given my selling price per unit. I can take sales divided by my per unit and arrive at units sold. And that's a very good first step on this problem. That's something I'd want to do right away. 3,000 divided by 10 is going to tell me that I sold 300 units. So now that I know that I sold 300 units, I also know that I can take that 300 units times my $7 variable expense per unit, and I'm going to arrive at $2,100 in total variable expenses. Right? Units times per unit, units sold times per unit amount equals your total variable expenses. And then contribution margin is easy from there. Take your sales minus variable expenses, 900 per unit. You take your selling price minus your variable expense per unit. So I make $3 per unit on a shirt. There's my unit CM. Unit CM is there. And let's do the percentages. We have 100% is always sales. 7 divided by 10 is 70% for variable expense ratio. 3 divided by 10 is 30% for CM ratio. So that's unit CM. Here's the CM ratio, just to make sure that we're on the same page here. Notice also, just to be quick, to quickly show you, 900. If you put 900 divided by 3,000 in your calculator, you'd end up with 0.3, which is that same 30% CM ratio. CM ratio is telling you what percentage of my sale dollars, what percentage of that $10 that I'm selling it for, do I keep per item sold that I can use towards applying towards fixed expenses. And then just finish out the income statement. 900 minus 550. It's going to give us a 900 minus my expenses of 550 will give me a profit of $350. Okay, last example. I want you to see this one. This one gives you units sold, total sales dollars, it gives you the CM ratio, and it gives you your net operating income. So this one's pretty interesting because now you need to figure out, you do have enough information to fill out the rest of this income statement. So what you need to do is just look at what you have and try to fill out a little at a time for this. One of the things I want to look at here is I know my total sales is $2,000, and we've already learned it. If I'm given my units sold and my total sales, I should be able to figure out my selling price per unit. So that can be a good next step right there, is I'm going to take $2,000 divided by 200 units, and I'm going to arrive at $10 selling price per unit. Next step, let's use this 40% here as my next step. I know that, and this is something that we, let's look at this other income statement here with my CM ratio. Notice how you took your contribution margin of $3 divided by your selling price of $10 and arrived at a CM ratio of 30%. Well, what's the opposite of that? If I took my selling price and I multiplied it by 30%, see how I can get my CM per unit of $3? $10 times 30% equals $3 here. And I'm looking in total, $3,000 of sales times 30% equals $900 of margin. So what I can do now is I can multiply these two numbers. I can multiply my sales times my 40% contribution margin and get my dollar contribution margin. And I also can multiply my sales price by my contribution margin to get my CM per unit. So let's do that. If I take 2,000 of my sales times 40% contribution margin, 2,000 times 0.4 is $800. Basically, it's saying 40% of my sales I keep as margin. So 40% of these sales I keep. That's $800 I keep. And then also on a per unit basis, 40% of every $10 sale, how much do I keep as profit? $4. Well, it's margin before I cover my fixed expenses. So I know my contribution margin in total is $800. I know that my per unit is $4, and I have a 40% percentage. Now I should be able to fill out the rest of my statement. If sales minus variable expenses equals contribution margin, 2,000 minus what equals 800. And to do that, all I do is take 2,000 minus 800. So I'm going to do it in reverse. I know that my variable expenses are $1,200. I know my variable expense per unit is $6. And then I know that also a couple things here. Right away, even if I didn't know any of this information, if my CM ratio is 40%, I know that your variable expense ratio must be 60%, which is 100% minus your CM ratio. And then let's fill in this last item. Hey, we're not given fixed expenses, but we are given a net operating income of $100. What must my fixed expenses be? Well, if my contribution margin is $800, 800 minus what fixed expenses would equal $100. So you just take your contribution margin minus your NOI to get your $700 in fixed expenses. So it's really important that you understand how these income statements work. There are formulas built inside these income statements. Make sure you understand them. Units sold times per unit equals total. Total divided by per unit equals units sold. Total divided by units sold equals per unit. Sales times contribution margin percentage equals contribution margin. Selling price times contribution margin percentage equals contribution margin per unit. Selling price times variable expense percentage equals variable expense per unit. In these simple income statements, these are all very simple formulas that you can see right here embedded in this income statement. So all these formulas are listed in your chapter, but they're all right here. So let's look at, work through those. We're going to look at the next video to look at analyzing changes in activity and see how that affects your income statement. Thanks.